Hello, my name is Paris McGorman, and I'll be presenting alongside Emma Fox and Laura Walls. Point Pleasant Park is a recreational forested area located on the southern tip of Halifax, Nova Scotia. It is important to note that this land was colonized by Europeans when they arrived in 1749, and was traditionally known by the Mi'kmaq as Amnutukadi, meaning the place of spirits. This area is and was very significant as a place where Mi'kmaq people would gather for 7 days after the first full moon in spring. Following the colonization of this land, many trees were cleared for settlement and military purposes. In 1866, the land was officially made a park intended for recreational use, and so the forest was able to regrow into the Acadian forest type that had been there prior to being cleared. It is important to note that because the regeneration began at the same time, the forest was even age, making an even age Acadian forest. The soil within the park has also been reported to be quite shallow due to glacial movements that washed away sediment as they melted. This shallow soil and even age growth are contributors to how Hurricane Juan caused so much destruction to the park when it hit Halifax in 2003. The hurricane devastated 70% of the tree canopy in the park, destroying approximately 70,000 trees. Following the hurricane, efforts were made to preserve the young forest growth and to remove much of the dead and damaged trees. These restoration efforts took 9 months, and as of now, the forest has been able to grow for 19 years. So, we are able to observe what secondary succession has looked like in this Acadian forest, analyzing how the overall forest community, density of the dominant species, and species richness have changed over time. We will also be predicting how these factors will change as the forest moves towards its climax community. These are a few terms which are key to understanding this presentation. Succession is the concept which explains a change in a community over time following a disturbance. Secondary succession specifically refers to succession following a disturbance which does not create geological change. And the climax community refers to a point in which an equilibrium is reached in an ecological community, and little change occurs to the community metrics.
In each study site, all the living trees that were equal to or greater than 2.5 centimeters in diameter at breast height were identified and measured. Breast height is measured at 4.5 feet off the ground. Breast height was used to ensure consistency throughout the measurements. Sites were chosen for variation and accessibility. The sites are next to park trails so that they were easy to access. To add, some sites are closer to the water while others are more inland. This allowed for compensation of the possible variation in tree species depending on location. These measurements gave us an estimate of the amount of wood in a stand of trees. This technique is commonly used by the logging industry. By using the industry standard, it allowed the results to be able to be compared easily to industry data. The linear regression model is used to predict the value of a variable based on the value of another variable. For this study, we compared either the total density, average diameter at breast height, species richness, Shannon diversity, Pylus evenness index, and the two dominant species, red spruce and red maple, against the year. A regression analysis was completed in order to observe the Shannon Diversity Index over time since Hurricane Juan. The Shannon Diversity Index is a measure of how diverse the species in a given community are. The regression analysis in Figure 1 shows a significant p-value of 1.6 times 10 to the negative 8th. This indicates that there is a positive correlation between Shannon Diversity Index and time. The null hypothesis that can therefore be rejected. Over the years from 2004 to 2023, there was an increase in tree species diversity in Point Pleasant Park. The overall forest community has changed drastically over time since Hurricane Juan. Diversity has been a key factor in this. The species of trees in Point Pleasant Park have become significantly more diverse since the hurricane. As discussed in the scientific report, changes in forest structure, species diversity, and spatial pattern following hurricane disturbance in a Piedmont, North Carolina forest, USA. This is most likely due to a removal of larger canopy trees, allowing an increase in the growth rate of existing mid-story and understory tree species, resulting in a more diverse forest. To add, it is predicted that as the forest community moves towards its climax community, the diversity of the forest will eventually plateau. A climax community is an ecological community in which populations of plants or animals remain stable and exist in balance with each other and their environment. A climax community is the final stage of succession, remaining relatively unchanged until destroyed by an event such as a fire or human interference.
Red spruce was a dominant species in the park in 2004. The increase in the density of red spruce from 2004 to 2023, as shown in Figure 2, was significant with a p-value of 0.002. The increase in the density of red maple trees from 2004 to 2023 was even more significant, as shown in Figure 3 with a p-value of 0.0001. The density of red maple trees in Point Pleasant Park has surpassed the density of red spruce significantly by 2023. A few years before the hurricane, a large number of red spruce trees were removed from the park in order to contain the population of the brown spruce longhorn beetle, which could contribute to the more dominant population of red spruce trees as compared to red maple in 2004. Some of the red spruce that was dominant in 2004 could also be due to the residual mature trees that remained intact after the hurricane, and could also be due to the slower growth rate of red spruce trees, which is approximately 400 years when compared to red maple trees at a maturity rate of approximately 150 years. As the forest reaches its climax community, we may see a rise in the red spruce population again as the trees reach maturity.
A linear regression analysis was completed in order to examine the change in species richness over time following Hurricane Juan, analyzing data measured from 2004 until the present year, 2023. Species richness is a measure of the number of species within an area. Looking at Figure 4, it can be observed that the species richness increased from the year 2004 to the year 2023, with an average number of species in 2023 being over 4 times the average in 2004. In other words, it can be observed from Figure 4 that there is a positive linear increase of species richness across time. The R-squared value was found to be 0.6418, which is greater than 60% and indicates that there's a strong relationship between species richness and time. The p-value was also significant, meaning we can reject the null hypothesis, indicating that there is a significant positive relationship between species richness in Point Pleasant Park over time in years. So, we can begin to ask why this trend of increase in species richness has occurred. We can understand that in 2004, the year of the hurricane, the species richness was at its lowest due to the destruction caused by Hurricane Juan, which forcefully removed many trees and in turn decreased the number of species present. Following this disturbance, the increase of richness is a typical characteristic of secondary succession. As explained within Maria Turchin's report, it is typical that richness will increase following a disturbance as newly growing and returning species are able to take advantage of unused resources. Also, it is explained that the first species to reestablish following a disturbance are typically smaller, and typically cannot tolerate shade and have shorter lifespans and very effective dispersal. Then, in time, more long-lived species will begin to reestablish themselves. It can be expected that as this community moves towards its climax community, the species richness will begin to level off as the number of possible new species which are viable in the area decreases, and the long-lived species grow taller, limiting the number of shade-intolerant species that could occupy the park.
Hurricane Juan hit Halifax in September of 2003, causing extensive damage to the indigenous biodiversity in Point Pleasant Park. The park has a rich history of being used as a spiritual ceremonial space by the Mi'kmaq community and contains native biodiversity dominated by Acadian forest species, including hemlock, yellow birch, balsam fir, white birch, red maple, and red oak, as documented in a report by the Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources. As an urban park, Point Pleasant allows city dwellers to experience and appreciate native species and a healthy forest ecosystem. Such interventions, such as removing dead woody debris to prevent fire hazards for public safety, have left the forest more vulnerable to storms. As the climate warms, high wind events that disturb vegetation and soil are likely to become more frequent. Understanding the impacts that these events have on our urban forests is important for regeneration and future maintenance. There are many human impacts and management practices that can affect succession as an urban park, and as urbanization and the human population increases, so will use of the park. Heavy use of the park by the public for recreational purposes disturbs natural growth patterns by compacting the soil with foot traffic, which can cause a reduction of root space and air in the soil, increasing erosion and hindering plant growth. The park is heavily fragmented by walkways, which can alter the natural hydrology of the area. A report written by Jim Jotham in 1985 showed evidence of soil erosion surrounding the pathways due to storm runoff. Management of the park is by the city to control pest populations, remove downed trees, and dead debris, which can also affect natural succession. As an urban forest, Point Pleasant Park is separated from larger forest landscapes, and therefore a regeneration after high wind events is more likely to be impeded due to the lack of natural seed dispersal. The trends in the data, including the Shannon Diversity Index and species richness, are still increasing as of 2023, so we can see that the forest has not yet reached its climax community. As the forest reaches maturity, we will likely see more growth of shade-tolerant trees and trees with longer lifespans, such as the red spruce tree. The composition of the mature forest will likely be similar to the pre-hurricane ecosystem. The indigenous people make up 4 to 5% of the world's population, but maintain up to 85% of the world's protected areas. So we need to take their teachings into account. Practices we can implement when using the park include remembering that all things are connected, being mindful of stepping on flora and fauna in the forest, and trying to stay on designated walkways. Respect the space and never leave debris or garbage. Try to leave it the way you found it. And take moments of gratitude. Pause and take a deep breath and appreciate that we have a forest to explore so close to home.
As previously mentioned, the effects of human activity and intervention have huge impacts on the ecological communities of urban parks like Point Pleasant Park. A report written by Burley in 2008 outlines the potential threats and challenges that particularly urban parks face following a disturbance such as Hurricane Juan. Although the intentions are of good nature, sometimes human intervention can cause harm and obstacles to forest recovery. For example, in order to maintain clear walkways and to prevent the risk of forest fire, fallen organic debris is routinely, and especially following the hurricane, removed from the park. Well, yes, this was meant to be an aid to forest recovery. It may actually be causing problems that will affect forest succession further down the line. The removal of this organic material has actually caused the soil to lack adequate nutrients, which makes the growing conditions following a disturbance more difficult.
If a similar disturbance to Hurricane Juan were to occur, it would still impact Point Pleasant Park even at its current successional stage. Succession stops temporarily when a climax community forms. Such communities remain in a relative equilibrium until a disturbance restarts the succession process over again. The changes may not be the same, as succession doesn't always follow the same path, and that climax communities are not always uniform and stable. It could vary by any of the variables discussed in this report, but as this is secondary succession, it is most likely that the forest will reproduce the original climax community because the cycle hasn't been fully restarted, as the soil and nutrients are still present.
As the global temperature increases, extreme weather events such as hurricanes and forest fires will become more frequent. All human interaction and intervention has an effect on forest succession and regeneration. We must find the delicate balance between such interventions that are important in preventing forest fires without hindering the natural process of succession. This will allow the park to be more resilient to future hurricanes. By limiting our impact on the forest, both directly by reducing our physical effects on the flora and fauna that reside there, and indirectly by reducing our carbon footprint, we do have an intrinsic responsibility to support forest restoration. We should try to do our part to reduce our impact by having sustainable practices. Thank you to all the Dalhousie students and professors before us that have done extensive research and documentation of the changes in Point Pleasant Park over the years. And thank you to the Mi'kmaq community who actively contribute to conservation efforts in Nova Scotia and previously used Point Pleasant Park as a spiritual and ceremonial space.